Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study to the Odyssey, book 19, Penelope and Her Guest. This is a really important and pivotal book because finally, after 20 years, after all of the books that preceded, finally we are going to get Odysseus and Penelope together. Not fully together, but certainly together. That is to say, in the same geographic space, we might say. In many ways, then we could argue that the Odyssey is a love story of a kind. I mean, remember in book 5, line 242, Odysseus will turn down Calypso and say, "I'd rather be with Penelope than be immortal and live with you." Things as well are made clear when we think about this. This will be the last night that either of these two will spend alone. The next day will, of course, be the famous day, and then, of course, we're on to it, right? We then as well will, in this book, learn about Odysseus' name, which will mean one who causes pain or suffering, and as well receives pain or suffering. We're also going to get this amazing moment when Penelope will tell us what she thinks of Troy, and she's going to reinvent the word destroy, and we'll have much to say about that at line 299. And the question will be for us, does Penelope know that who she's talking to in the old beggar is in fact Odysseus? And finally, we're going to get, amazingly, two different stories of young men in this book. We're going to get one of Telemachus, a scene with Telemachus, and one with Odysseus. And it's going to tell us volumes about the differences between the two. Now, really quickly, if you haven't been following our stuff, make sure you hit learnstrong.net, go to the AP folder, and find our lectures. Let's really review quickly. The first 4 books, the Telemachus, we have in book 1, Telemachus' mission to grow up at page 340. Line 340. In book 2, we have Telemachus leaving to go and to seek out information. In book 3, we have him at Pylos with Nestor. In book 4, we have him with Menelaus and Helen. And then we leave Telemachus and we move then to Odysseus. Book 5, on Calypso's island, finally released. Book 6, with Nausicaa. Book 7, with the Phaeacians. And book 8, the famous Phaeacian games, and more particularly, Demodocus, the great blind poet. Books 9 through 12 are the flashback books. Where has Odysseus been? He tells us the story. The land of the lotus eaters, book 9, as well as Polyphemus and blinding him and the curse to ensue. Book 10, we have the Lystrigonians, and all of his men are crushed except for the ones in his ship. And then he ends up on the island of Circe for a year. Book 11, we have his journey to the house of the dead, where he meets Tiresias, his mother, and a number of other people. Book 12, we are back to the island of Circe to bury Elpenor, and then the sailing past the Sirens, and past Scylla and Charybdis, and finally eating the cattle on the sun god's island. Book 13, the Phaeacians are going to return Odysseus back to Ithaca, and for that they are cursed. Book 14, Odysseus is with Eumaeus, the swineherder, and we get a long story about where he comes from. Book 15, Telemachus is with Menelaus and Helen and will be told to get back home. Book 16 is the major reuniting book between Odysseus and Telemachus and their plans. And book 17, Odysseus arrives at the palace, and we will have Argos dying right outside the walls. It's one of those tragic stories. Book 18, we will have the fight between Iris and Odysseus, and they'll contest. Penelope will come down beautified. This is the first actually view that Odysseus will get of his wife, but it will be here in this text that we will have in book 19. We'll have them together for the first time. Also, Melanthia, who will come back, who is the sister of Melanthius, who has already insulted, as the goat herd has insulted Odysseus. Melanthia will also insult Odysseus as well. Now, just to remind, I'm hoping that you're using my comments here to help you in your reading, and you're doing your own reading. Our learning theory, again, is always to ask that you are connecting new information to old information in terms of our reading annotative approach at level 1, summary at level 2. We're always looking to try to find meaning at 2A. We are working at the rhetorical level at 2B with symbol and irony, and then at level 3A we're working with our conversation of the Iliad. For example, consider this. In book 19, we're in book 19 of the Odyssey. In book 19 of the Iliad, this is when Achilles will dress for battle after he and Agamemnon have kissed and made up and buried the hatchet. This is interesting because we're going to get some interesting kind of comparisons even in 19. Let's do a real quick summary of book 19, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time with the actual language more than normal this book demands that we spend a lot of time with the language, and I want to share it with you as best I can. First, we'll have Odysseus with Telemachus hiding weapons. Then we will have Penelope with Odysseus having a conversation that is multi-layered. Finally, we will have Euryclea, who will see the famous scar of Odysseus. We even get a history of that scar, and it is going to be one of those recognition scenes we've been talking about. And finally, we have Penelope telling Odysseus a dream about an eagle-killing geese, which will be interpreted, of course, as Odysseus is coming back to kill suitors. And then finally, Penelope's plan to put up 12 axe heads and to have all of the suitors string Odysseus' bow, and the one that can do it the best is the one that she will marry. Now, I would love to be able to read all of this with you. I just can't. But we will at least begin and pay attention to some of the lines. I'll do my best here with you in the amount of time that I have, which isn't much, but I'll hurry and try and see what we can do to help you. Right away at the beginning of book 19, we have Odysseus alone with Telemachus, and it's time now to stow the weapons. He reminds Telemachus about what he said before regarding the lie that he needs to tell if anybody tests him about removing the weapons. They're smoky, they've been damaged, we got to clean them, and we don't want weapons around a bunch of drunk men. That's the argument that will be made, right? Again, we're reminded that Odysseus is going to slaughter 118 bad guys, he and his son, who are in fact defenseless. We're told that Telemachus did his father's will at once at line 15 or so, and calls out to our old nurse Euryclea. Euryclea, Eury meaning all, Clea of course from Kleos, that is to say world famous we might say. Quick, he says, close the women up in their quarters till I can stow my father's weapons in the storeroom. Splendid gear lying about neglected black with soot since father sailed away. I was only a boy then, now I must safeguard them from the smoke. This idea that Telemachus is in fact evolving and growing and moving beyond being a boy, we're going to see several times in here. Euryclea will say it's about time. Why don't you actually safeguard all of your treasures? In other words, get rid of these stupid suitors is the suggestion. And then she asks, well, what about the light? Don't you need me to carry light? And he says, no, I'm going to have this old man help me. And so she does so. They are alone. It's a fascinating thing as they are carrying all the weapons out. And you'll remember earlier that Odysseus told his boy to do this, but now he's helping him. As they carry the weapons out, we're told Pallas Athena strode before them at line 38. Lifting a golden lamp that cast a dazzling radiance about them. In other words, Athena is helping them do this. Think about this. This is the first time that actually Telemachus has seen any clear evidence that Athena is on their side. And he says, Father, suddenly bursts out to Odysseus. Oh, what a marvel fills my eyes. Look, look, there, all the sides of the hall. The handsome crossbeams, pinewood rafters, the tall columns towering, all glow in my eyes like flaming fire. Surely a god is here, one of those who rule the vaulting skies. In other words, young Telemachus is behaving as you would expect a young boy to behave. He cannot believe this. He's totally blown away by this. Quiet, said his father. The old soldier warned him. Get a grip on yourself. No more questions now. It's just the way of the gods who rule Olympus. Off you go to bed. I'll stay here behind to test the women. Test your mother too. Now I want to point out how subtle, brilliantly subtle this is. A little bit later in this book, we're going to hear about the young Odysseus, who goes to Parnassus on a mountain, and he has a hunting trip where he is wounded by a boar and almost dies. And when he comes back, he's so excited to tell his parents about how he survived the experience, how he's got this scar on his leg. It's a mark of identification. In other words, Telemachus never got to have what Odysseus had growing up. He's never been allowed to be a boy. And at the moment when he expresses some of those, whoa, Dad, check this out, this is amazing, the dad says to him, enough, we got work to do, keep quiet and let's go to work. Or go to your room and go to sleep. We just think about all the things that Telemachus lost, and of course, all the things that Odysseus lost as well, right? So off we go, and Telemachus will go to bed. Penelope, we're told, will come down, looking very much like Artemis or golden Aphrodite. Down she will come. Here Penelope took her place in front of the fireplace. They meet at the hearth. That is to say, the meeting place in culture is significant, where they're doing this conversation, right? Penelope, by the way, is not alone. She will have a couple of people with her, at least 3 that we know of, and one of those will be the nasty sister of Melantho, who will insult him again. Odysseus will again give a killing glance, we're told, and at line 80, he says, it's the fate that drives me on. That's the lot of beggars, homeless drifters. And then he says it, I too once lived in a lofty house and all of that. I had servants. I had all that life of ease could offer me. He says, but Zeus ruined it all. God's will, no doubt. So he says to Melantho, beware, woman, or one day you may lose it all your glitter that puts your workmates in the shade. In other words, you're the most beautiful of the women, but someday it may be taken away. We're reminded, and we'll study this later together in AP, of when we meet that famous scene, the Yorick scene as it's called in Hamlet, the play, when young Hamlet stands next to the grave of Ophelia, picks up the skull of Yorick and says, get thee to my lady's chamber and tell her to paint it on an inch thick. This is what she must come to. This same idea that someday you may be beautiful now, but not always. And finally he finishes, or your mistress may just fly in a rage and dress you down, or Odysseus may return, or he says there's still room for hope. Then there's the son Telemachus. In other words, you better watch out the way you're treating me. You may get jacked. Telemachus, he says, he's come of age at last. We're back to that notion that Telemachus isn't a boy anymore. It is Penelope, however, who will turn on Melantho and will say, make no mistake, you brazen, and she says it, shameless bitch. This is the second time that Melantho will be treated this way by both Odysseus and Penelope. None of your ugly work escapes me either. You will pay for it with your life, you will. How well you knew. You heard from my own lips that I meant to probe the stranger in our house and ask about my husband. My heart breaks for him. This is important because Melantho, we know, is of course messing around with your with one of the suitors, right? And with Eurycleus. And because of that, Odysseus has to be very, very careful. He can't give anything away about who he is, right? Because if she finds out, she'd immediately go and tell the suitors would turn around and kill him. So this is really, in many ways, life or death. A chair is brought, they find themselves together, and she asks the first now words. She says, stranger, line 115, let me start our questioning myself. Who are you? Where are you from, your city, your parents? And it will be Odysseus, and of course this is the mantra of the entire poem, right? Who is Odysseus? And Odysseus will say, my good woman, he says, please don't make me say who I am. Now, often we have pointed out that maybe Odysseus doesn't want to lie to his wife, and so outright he just says, please don't ask me who I am because you're going to ask me to lie. Ultimately, of course, he will have to lie, right? He says, don't ask me. And then he says, I'm a man who's had his share of sorrows, 130. It's wrong for me in someone else's house to sit here moaning and groaning, sobbing. So we heard this earlier when he said in the Odyssey, what's the point of crying? It doesn't change anything anyway. Penelope will then say, I have lost everything, right? I'm not beautiful anymore. I've lost my life. My life is a torment, she says. I spin out, she says, I yearn for Odysseus at line 150. Always my heart pines away. They rush the marriage on, and I spin out my wiles. A god from the blue it was, inspired me first to set up a great loom in our royal halls. And I began to weave, and the weaving fine spun, the yarns endless. I would lead them on. And of course we know about this because one of the suitors, of course, mentioned this in book 2, when Telemachus calls his famous assembly, and Penelope's weaving of a story, and we understand why this is such an important mantra throughout the entire Odyssey. She says, I can finish off this web, right, of the weaving, and yet she gets caught, and for 3 years she's able to pull it off. She was caught. In other words, you almost get the sense that what Penelope is saying to this old man, who maybe she thinks could be her husband, or knows something about her husband, she's saying, I did everything in my power to try and withstand these suitors. I've run out of options. Might be a way for us to interpret all of this, right? She says, Zeus grants my son the honor, but for all that, none, she says, now tell me who you are, line 181. Where'd you come from? You're hardly sprung from a rock or an oak like some old man of legend. And we're told, the master improviser answered slowly, my lady, wife of Laertes' son Odysseus, will your questions about my family never end? All right then, here's my story, even though it plunges me into deeper grief than I feel now. But that's the way of the world when one has been so far from home, as long away as I, roving over many cities of men, enduring many hardships. They're referencing to Tennyson's Ulysses, a poem that we'll study together later. I've mentioned it already before. Many cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, so many lines are going to hearken back to Tennyson's Ulysses. We didn't get Odysseus' story. This is, of course, the Crete story. He even tells her his name as Aethia. And he says, I saw Odysseus, but it was on his way to Troy. And we're told at line 235, falsehoods all. He gave his falsehoods all the ring of truth. As she listened on, her tears flowed and soaked her cheeks. And then we get this amazing epic simile. As the heavy snow melts down from the high mountain ridges, snow the west wind piles there. In other words, as the mountain starts to melt all of its ice pack, that's how she so dissolved in tears. And we're told Odysseus' heart went out to his grief-stricken wife, but under his lids, his eyes remained stock still. They might have been horn or iron. His guile brought back his tears. His guile fought back his tears. In other words, Odysseus feels sad for Penelope, his wife, but he can't let her know who he is, and so he just kind of sits there. Penelope then says, I'm going to test you. Come, she says, tell me what sort of clothing Odysseus wore when you saw him on his way to Troy. What kind of man was he? What of the men who followed in his train? At line 250. Now this is significant because the question will be, how do you identify the real Odysseus? There's got to be something, the way he dressed or the way he looked. Of course, we're going to see this as the scar that he will carry with him, right? And he says it, good woman. Odysseus, the great master of subtlety, returned. How hard it is to speak after so much time apart. Why, some 20 years have passed since he left my house and put my land behind him. Even so, imagine the man as I portray him. I can see him now. A little bit later, Penelope will echo the words of Telemachus. Was he a real man or was he a dream? Here we will have Odysseus talking about himself. But think about the power of this. He's remembering the day he left Ithaca. What were you wearing? And he'll say it that he likes to compliment himself on the way he was dressed. In line 270, women galore would gaze on what he was wearing, and especially this pin that he had with relish, he says. And this too, bear it in mind, won't you? I've no idea if Odysseus wore these things at home or a comrade gave him them as he boarded ship, or a host perhaps. The man was loved by many. There are few Achaeans to equal him. It's fun to see the ways that Odysseus compliments himself at different points in the story, right? He says that he had a herald with Odysseus, Eurybatus, and Penelope will then cry again, and she will say it. Now, stranger, much as I pitied you before, now in my house you'll be my special friend, my honored guest. I am the one myself who gave him the very clothes that you described. I brought them up from the storeroom. The eye here is brilliant. Folded them neatly, fastened the golden brooch to adorn my husband Odysseus. Never again will I embrace him, striding home to his native land. A black day it was, she says, when he took ship to see that cursed city. Destroy, I call it. I hate to say its name. Now, in the Greek, Kakos is evil, and so she says Kakolion, which is the evil city. T.E. Lawrence, Fagles will say this, by the way, on page 514 in his footnoting. T.E. Lawrence, the great Lawrence of Arabia, and we will mention Seven Pillars of Wisdom as a wonderful text for AP students to read. Certainly one of our favorites in room 303. T.E. Lawrence translated the Odyssey as one more thing that he was gifted to do. And he loved this idea of destroy as in D-E-S and then T-R-O-Y as the city of Troy. It's a wonderful, and italicized for Fagles to give credence to what T.E. Lawrence said. But destroy, we're going to get it 2 times in this book. In other words, Penelope wants to let us know and let Odysseus know what it is that Troy and the battle of Troy took away from her. Odysseus will say, I don't blame you for your sorrows. And I'm sure that any woman would mourn the bridegroom she's lost, lain with in love, and bored his children too. Notice he doesn't say child because it's only the one, right? He says, I will tell you the whole truth and hide nothing. The ironies are interesting because he actually does tell her quite a bit of truth. I've heard that Odysseus now at last is on his way. He's just in reach. The man is still alive. He's bringing home a royal hoard of treasure, gifts he won from the people of those parts. He says his crew has been destroyed because they ate the cattle of the sun god. And he says, in fact, Odysseus would have been here beside you long ago. But he thought it better, shrewder course to recoup his fortunes roving through the world. This idea of Odysseus as rover, as roamer from Tennyson's Ulysses, again, born from lines like this. Notice it's always for Odysseus about the teammate. It's always about the Scooby snacks. Just like Penelope in Book 18, line 340, when she's trying to get Scooby snacks or teammate from the suitors. He says, I had to go, and Odysseus had to go and get and get all of his treasure. And then King Phaidon, he says, showed this beggar the treasure. He said, I actually got to see the treasure. But Odysseus, at line 340, he made it clear it was off at Dodona then to hear the will of Zeus that wrestles forth from the god's tall Lephio. How should he return after all these years away to his own beloved Ithaca, openly or in secret? Odysseus is outright suggesting that if Odysseus comes back, he may come back in secret and not outright, which, of course, would lead Penelope to maybe think that she's talking to her husband right then. But then notice the position she's in. There's two renderings of what's going on with Penelope. One is she's shrewd. We know that about her. And she figures it out. I'm talking to my husband, but there's absolutely no way I can talk to him directly. I have to talk to him in code language because Melantho will go and tell the suitors and my husband will be killed. That's one view. The other view says that Penelope has no idea and she really doesn't believe that Odysseus will ever come back at all. Right? He says it though. Odysseus is close at hand. And he says, true, this very month, just as the moon dies, the new moon rises into life, Odysseus will return. Ironies, of course, abound. Penelope will say, if only, she says, but my heart consents the way it all will go. Odysseus, I tell you, is never coming back, nor will you ever gain your passage home. Note the irony of that. She says, you're stuck here with me. For we have no masters in our house like him at welcoming or sending off an honored guest. Odysseus, there was a man, or was he all a dream? Reminding us, of course, of what Telemachus had asked in Book 15, line 298. Was my dad real, or was he a dream? The fact that Odysseus is really not real until he finally gets home to Ithaca, and even when he's home at Ithaca yet, he's still not real. When will Odysseus finally become real? And of course, it's in that moment in Book 22 when finally he's there. The next thing that has to be taken care of, or at the end of the day, is we need to wash this man. Penelope understands Xenia. She says,